John, I learned very early on from my budget covering days from you that there are three elements that make up a budget: the surplus, the deficit, and the politics of it. So let's get into that. What are the politics behind Budget 2022?
I think that many people expected this to be an NDP budget, inspired by the deal between the Liberals and the NDP. It would splurge money all over the place and reflect the more left-wing stance of this coalition in everything but name. In fact, it didn't necessarily do that. Now, while some of the provisions that the NDP had pushed for are in the budget, such as dental care for under 12s and some of the housing provisions, it did not go as far as spending all of the windfall in revenue that the government has received as a result of soaring commodity prices. I think the government is somewhat spooked by the geopolitical scene, by inflation, and by failure to increase productivity. So therefore, they're keeping their powder dry in a whole number of areas. I think to see Chrystia Freeland stand up there and start talking about fiscal anchors and restraint and prudence, fiscal responsibility, that was something new for me, and it was quite a surprise.
What are some of the things that stand out for you? We heard rumors ahead of the budget of this bank surtax. We now know that it's 15%, upwards of $1 billion for banks and life insurance companies. What's the messaging there? Do you think ultimately we'll see these companies pushing outside of our borders?
Well, I'm probably not the best qualified person to talk about what the banks are thinking about it. I know what the politicians are thinking about it, and it's not that complicated. I mean, this was in the Liberal platform, or at least a portion of this new excess profits tax was in the Liberal platform, essentially because people don't like banks. And if you campaign against them, that's a good political thing. So that wasn't a great surprise. It was pretty well signaled that, and of course, because of the NDP deal, the NDP dislike banks even more than most Canadians. So that was part of the agreement with the NDP, as was the spending on dental care, as was some of the housing initiatives. But again, I go back to the point that we've seen that this government receive a windfall of revenue. No great surprise. We know that commodity prices are going through the roof. That inevitably translates into higher revenues for the government. Obviously not good for consumers, but inflation is good for governments. And the deficit, which was forecast to be $144 billion just in December, turns out to be, or their forecast is that this year will be $113 billion. And that's a huge swing in revenues. I don't think I've ever seen that in the 20 years I've been covering budgets. And in future years, the total windfall the government said it was expecting to receive is somewhere around $85 billion. Now, normally with this government, they would spend that. Every windfall they've had in previous years, they have spent immediately mainly on social programs. On this occasion, there is new spending, and it comes in at somewhere around $62 billion. But for one thing, it's not all the social spending that they said they were going to do in their election platform. I mean, for example, there's $8 billion worth of spending on defense, $2.6 billion on the 50% tax credit for carbon capture. There are a whole bunch of things that they didn't campaign on in their election. So the spending is relatively restrained compared to what they said they were going to do. Not only that, it's offset by $25 billion worth of new revenues and spending cuts. You mentioned the bank taxes, which comes in somewhere around $9 billion in combination of the two measures. But there's also a whole bunch of reprofiling of money that was already in the fiscal framework for transit, for infrastructure. They say they've already booked $6 billion worth in program review savings. And there's another $3 billion that they say that they will get from spending that just won't take place, that they said they were going to do on COVID relief, but because the recovery has been so strong, they don't need to do it. So, the total of that, or the combination of all of that, is that program spending increases by an average of 2.2% in the coming years, compared to 6.4% in the years that they've been in power so far.
Let's just get into some of those revenue streams. The government introducing some new programs, the Canada Growth Fund, the Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency. Is that new? Have we been there before? And has this worked before?
Well, there was an OECD report that came out which suggested that Canada's per capita growth potential in the next decade is way at the back of the pack from the rich countries that make up the OECD. And this was referred to by officials in the media lockup yesterday. So I think that the government is a little bit spooked about the lack of innovation, the lack of business research and development spending. I mean, the budget mentions the fact that Canada's last out of its G7 peers when it comes to business R&D. So they're going to try something different. Now, I don't hold out great store that any of this is going to work. Certainly, it's not going to work overnight. Two new agencies, two new organizations that need to be set up. We've seen in the past with the Canada Infrastructure Bank that this government's implementation of some of its brighter ideas is not always as stellar. So, fingers crossed. I think it was interesting that they said that they're going to review the SRED tax credit. Now, people might not be familiar with this thing, but it spends an awful lot of money, $3 billion or so every year in a tax credit for research and development. But it sprinkles it like fairy dust around a lot of companies. And clearly, it's not working very well. Otherwise, we wouldn't be last in business R&D. This government hasn't really been concerned about productivity or innovation to this point, but I think things have reached such a state that it's going to try some new things. Just on the SRED tax credit, the Liberals tried to reform business taxes early in their mandate, I think 2017, and it didn't work because there were more losers than winners. And I think in trying to reform that tax credit, there will be a lot of losers, and the political cost will be such that they won't actually get around to meaningful change.
What's the opposition going to have a field day with?
Well, funnily enough, I think the Conservatives are going to have a harder time than the New Democrats. I mean, this was more. There would be a lot in here that would please a lot of Conservatives. Defence spending, the sense that finally this government is seeing the light when it comes to spending restraint. Now, don't mistake relief for enthusiasm here. I'm not suggesting that it's not spending any money, because it is, but it's a marked change from previous years. So, I mean, it was interesting that the Conservative press release on the budget looked like it had been written 2 days ago and had not been amended to take account of the fact that the budget was far more restrained than had been anticipated. So the Conservatives are in tough. The NDP will moan about things like the carbon capture tax credit, and yet they'd already signaled their acquiescence to the budget. So essentially, they're kind of out of the game for the next few years.